Welcome to Where'd Your Mind Just Go, a podcast by Coastal Therapy Group. This is a podcast about what happens when you let a question sit with you instead of rushing to answer it. Each episode, I sit down with a guest and we follow the conversation wherever it wants to take us. No agenda, no expertise required. Just an invitation to wonder and wander out loud together. We live in a world that really wants us to have things figured out. This is a space where we don't, and that's the whole point. So, if you're someone who likes to get a little lost in a good question, join us on the journey. Let's see what finds us along the way. Today's topic is one that, as a therapist, I really enjoy when I get to talk with clients about it, and that is money. Money can be such an evocative topic. Each one of us has a very different relationship to it. In everyday conversations, sometimes money can be a little taboo to talk about. And in our own personal relationships, sometimes it can carry feelings of guilt or shame or embarrassment. What I love about getting to talk through some of these things with clients is when I get to see them unburdening themselves from some of those feelings and finding new ways to relate to money. My guest today to talk about this difficult topic is Dr. Carly Claney. And this is another blast from the past conversation. She has her PhD in clinical psychology and is a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Washington. But she also has the ability to practice in 43 U.S. states with the Psychology Interjurisdictional Compact, or PsyPact for short. At the time of the recording, Dr. Claney was the owner of a group practice in Seattle and has since returned to solo practice where she specializes in depth-oriented psychotherapy and psychological testing for neurodivergent adults. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Carly Claney. Well, Dr. Carly Claney, thank you so much for joining me today. You're a psychologist and you have your own group called Relational Psych in Seattle. And today we're talking about money, which I think is something that all of us can relate to. It's something that all of us deal with on a daily basis, and it can be something that can be very emotional. It's something that I talk about a lot with my clients, is that money is emotional.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious a little bit about your experience with money. What are some of the earliest memories that you have, either about finances or money? Or what are some of the ways in which you learn some of your own basic foundational financial skills?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, it started really early on in my family. My family of origin was the way, I think for a lot of people, money is introduced and then you begin to learn and explore. So my story involves my dad being a business owner. So he was trained as a chiropractor and then was in private practice himself. And then in addition to that, he was an entrepreneur. So he wrote and published a novel. Um, he invented an exercise machine. He
Oh,
ran like a
wow.
successful Facebook marketing page. So he did a lot of different things when I was young.
Yeah.
And so I think from really early on, I began to see the variability with money, the lessons around money and budgeting. And I can talk about that a little bit more. And then also from my story that the opportunity that an entrepreneur lifestyle was an option. I think for people whose family they don't own businesses, you don't always see that is like
Hmm.
possible. And with that, money again can be quite variable or even more managed in a way.
Hmm.
And then in contrast to that, my mom was a nurse, and for my whole life, she worked at the same hospital, a couple of different jobs, but the same stable income. So, or position rather, income. I know it's variable. So having these two models for how income or money was produced
Hmm.
was a really interesting contrast because I saw them working together. I saw my dad having really successful years in his practice, which then meant taxes the next year were really high and then
Uh-huh.
slower years in the practice. So then, years that my mom would take on more
Mm.
shifts or pick up extra shifts when we needed to go on vacation or when they started paying for college. So I think those really early family experiences of, again, how money was brought into the home showed me that could be variable, it could be different, it could fluctuate. And in addition to that, my parents also taught me and my siblings pretty basic budgeting skills from a pretty early age. We had allowance. I don't remember how old we are when we started it. Um, and there was this framework already with our allowance of this is the percent that you give to the church, and this is how much you
Hmm.
save for gifts. This is how much you save, this is how much you can spend. So percentage wise. So again, really early on, I think I was taught budgeting skills. I was taught to think about money. I was taught to know things about money, which I think in other families, money just wasn't talked about, or there
Hmm.
was so much emotion or so much scarcity or different things that clouded it. So I think those were the early things for me for money, and my story kind of evolved from there. But yeah, I think that was really foundational for me to get interested in
Totally.
finances.
Yeah, I think what stands out is just how collaborative your parents were. You sort of described how they were coming at it from two different sort of industries, two different perspectives. And
Yeah,
there was the ability to sort of cover for, and I think also if we talk about like gender roles, it doesn't sound like there was a whole lot tied to like, oh, one person has to be the breadwinner. And if that doesn't happen,
hmm,
then our family is feeling the impact of that, that there's a flexibility in that. I think that's
totally.
really cool that you learned a lot of those foundational skills. And I'm curious also as a therapist, I think financial stress is something that a lot of people can experience. What are some of the things that you observe as a therapist with clients coming in wanting to talk about finances or maybe not even wanting to, but feeling the anxiety or the stress of their own financial situation? What are some of the things that you see being brought up in terms of what emotions are tied to money or make it hard to have good financial health?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think the first things that come to mind are shame and
Mhm.
anxiety and other things where it comes to like maybe scarcity or, well, I'll say scarcity or abundance or
Mhm.
control or empowerment, like an agency. All of these things get really wrapped up in our relationship with money. So I think for a lot of people, it is something to be avoided, or even culturally maybe avoided to be respectful. It's
Mhm.
not something we talk about as readily as we talk about other things. Even politics, I think, is a lot more easy to talk about than money.
Yeah.
So I think to even begin entering into a therapeutic relationship, understanding that money can be talked about and not just, I mean, I don't want to minimize it, but not just financial stress, which is, I think, something like, oh, yeah, money is tight this week or this year.
Mhm.
That might be something that is easy to talk about. Or, oh, my taxes were so high this year. That could be something easy to throw out. But
Yeah.
when we start talking a little into the layers deeper
Mhm.
about our relationship to money and our emotions of like actual shame about money, or feeling out of control, or
Mhm.
feeling out of control in terms of like not having agency or power in the world, or other cultural factors, like all of those things I think can make it so much more hidden.
Mhm.
So
Totally.
other things I think with the anxiety piece and control, I think personality plays a role in it too. So if someone feels out of control with their behaviors, then again, shame can come
Mhm.
into play with it. There can also be a lot of shame about having more money than your peers or the
Mhm.
other people
Mhm.
in your cultural group.
Yeah.
So not knowing what to do with wealth or
Mhm.
privilege, that shows up a lot. And then I'd also say, like, especially in couples work or any relationship.
I think it's so interesting what you said about how it's easier to talk about politics these days, it feels like, than money
Yeah.
that, I feel like one of I forget what the acronym was, but, the hot topics that you don't talk about with people or strangers are like faith or religion, money, politics, and politics has kind of sort of been in the forefront of everybody's mind, I think, the last,
Yeah.
several years. But money really, I think, is still taboo in a lot of circles and a lot of places, and I think about my own experience growing up with money or growing up sort of learning about money, and my dad was a pastor, my mom was a homemaker, so we didn't have a ton, but I never felt lacking, that was my experience
Mhm.
growing up, is that whenever I asked my parents, "How much does dad make?" or "How much money do we have?" The answer was always enough, which was never satisfying to me as a kid, but it
Yeah.
sort of painted a picture, it sort of created a culture within our family, and I think growing up watching my parents, how they handled money and how they talked about money, I think for me, it created this expectation that I was never gonna be quote unquote rich. Like that was never in the cards for me. And so when I
Mhm.
went to grad school and started to think about becoming a psychologist, sort of being at the top of this field, it felt very foreign to what I grew up with. And
Yeah.
so, I think the kinds of dynamics that you're describing, I think can be very personal and internal, and it can be hard to place yourself among your peers. Or I think something that's been talked about in different circles is like pay transparency, being able to have a reality tested, reality grounded understanding of like, what is my industry paying, or what are people in similar positions getting paid? And I think all those types of things and questions can be really challenging when there's emotions like you described of shame or anxiety, feelings of guilt. I'm curious for you, as you've sort of stepped into some entrepreneurial roles yourself, what has been your evolving relationship with money now that it's not just, getting an allowance, having perhaps lower stakes, like when you're a kid and your parents are sort of more responsible for that versus being on your own. And I think, there can be sort of a transition period when you're going through college. Maybe you get your own credit card, your first bank account, and you're starting to learn some of what it's like to be in the real world with money versus now for you having your own business, hiring employees, managing your own family's finances. How do you feel like your relationship with money has sort of evolved over time?
Yeah, I have so many thoughts about that. I want to
That's a big
like try to,
question.
yeah, get all of my
Yeah.
thoughts out there. Because I
Mhm.
think one of the things that just came to mind is I think for me, it was fun. Like
Mm.
it's almost a game for me. And I think that comes from a lot of privilege, which we can talk about more. But
Yeah.
I think for me, you mentioned getting a credit card, and I think about the points and then investing and compound interest. I think for
Mhm.
me, it was always this puzzle
Yeah.
that how can I, as I get started, um, not like hack it, but how can I learn it so that I can be on top of it um, and feel empowered to create a future for myself or create a business that's really successful, not just for me as a business owner, but for my employees. So I think fun has been a way that has kept me motivated and interested, which I understand most people do not experience that with money.
Mhm. Mhm.
Fun, I love spreadsheets, I love taxes, like I love the game of it. So
Yeah.
that for me is a way to stay interested in it. The other thing I think when you thinking about culture and gender and those kinds of identity factors, I think that was another way that kept me really involved. That as a woman, I think a woman business owner who's also interested in money, there's
Mhm.
a lot of business owners who aren't, who are still fearful of money or avoidant of that part of their business. And again,
Totally.
that was just never part of me. So I think when I started to get more educated, not just from my family, but getting other mentors outside of my family, business coaches, listening to podcasts, whatever, I started to see that it wasn't just, this personal experience of money, which still is quite motivating,
Mhm.
but it was also a way of shifting the more cultural narrative about
Mm.
money. So me
Yeah.
being a female with money almost was this way of pushing back against historical, times where I wouldn't have been allowed to have money. So, for example, it wasn't until I had to write it down, 1974, that
Mhm.
women in the US were granted the right to open a bank account on their own.
Wow.
So if I was
That is
born,
so
what is
recent.
that? It's so recent. It's so
It's
recent. And so if I
crazy.
was born, 2 generations ago, what I'm doing with my life would just not have been possible.
Mhm.
Similar things, I'm a white woman, but if I was not a white woman and again born 50 years ago, or if I was a black man, or there's so many other parts of my identity that born in any other time in the world,
Mhm.
again, what I'm doing with my life would not be possible. Or today, it would still be influenced by these generational cultural factors. So
Yeah.
that also just felt quite important for me as I was learning my journey.
Mhm.
Both to take advantage of that and say, okay, these are rights that I have now. How can I explode them and grow them as much as possible?
Mhm.
But also be sensitive to, like, from a gender perspective, the education that women have now, um, is the history of it is so short.
Mhm.
Whereas,
Mhm.
let's say, compared to white men, hundreds and hundreds of years of generational education and passing that on and
Mm.
learning and being comfortable with things.
Totally.
So that again, there's like more grace, I think, with that as a woman or other identity factors, but then also
Mm.
more almost responsibility that it feels important to me to not shy away from that. Like now that I have the opportunity, I want to, again, like just have it explode into this really like successful thing.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to sort of what you were describing of wanting to be intentional about the message you're putting out there. And I think, as therapists, we try to be as intentional as we can about all the decisions that we make that impact our clients. And that
Yeah.
includes money and it includes finances. And I think, I liked how you said that, sort of a value neutral thing. It's not that we're value neutral people, but that there are ways, I think, to perhaps decouple ourselves from some of the emotions that money inevitably brings up. And
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that, uh, my, yeah, I mean, when I think of, I'm just sort of turning over my head, like all the ways that I feel about money, like there are very powerful positive feelings when I have, and there's very negative feelings when I don't have. Um, and that, scarcity mindset can be so like gripping sometimes. Um, you know, how have you sort of navigated some of those valences between like, high highs, low lows, and like, trying to find some sort of landing points of having perhaps more value neutral positions,
Hmm.
especially when it comes to something like, I'll just sort of share a little bit of my own experience of, being in private practice. Uh, it kind of feels like being a uh, commission salesman where the money that I bring in is based on how many people I see. And that's just sort of the reality of it. Um,
Yeah.
and, there's no, like for me in my position, I know that there's different models out there, but for me in my position, there is no salary that I get regardless of how many people I see. It's purely based upon the numbers, which has its good and its bads. But, I noticed in the, first few years of stepping into private practice and being on my own in that regard, it did feel very swingy in that sense of, when I'm first building up my caseload, just one client canceling felt like it was impacting my monthly like income.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really hard in our field. There are others where it does become personal or does feel, you feel that weight of that
Totally.
one client. Whereas a little bit more space, a little bit more time, there might be more buffer. But I
Mhm.
think what comes to mind is I really do think knowledge is power. So
Mm.
being able to confront and not avoid all of the difficult feelings that emerge about, oh, now I'm resenting this client, or now I'm really scared, or I'm realizing I need this client.
Mhm.
Being able to be really honest with yourself and take that in, acknowledge it. I think it allows you insight that allows you to do something with that information rather than just have it hold you hostage by being unmetabolized. So that's the first place my mind goes. I think when it comes to other aspects of our finances, again, I think understanding your numbers is another way of taking power there. So knowing your income, or for what you're saying, like income potential. I like to think too, like what's my ideal number? What's my okay, I'm surviving number, and what's my like panic number?
Mhm.
And being able to have those different tiers helps you regulate as much, like cognitively at least regulate of like,
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
actually have to be fearful here.
Mhm.
But when it's in the danger zone, yeah, it's panicky. Like I might
Mhm.
not pay rent this month. And now I go into more of that survival approach. But if I'm, two layers up, if I'm going into survival, let's be curious about that. Why am I feeling that way if the reality isn't there?
Mhm.
Same thing with debt and habits. Uh, I also think it's important to know your personality. So if and how you use money as coping. So for
Mm.
a lot of people, and money might be this way. You're going to punish yourself or reward yourself.
Yeah.
I'm going to buy myself a treat because I deserve it because I, had a hard day, or I had a hard day. I'm going to withhold money here. I'm not going
Mm.
to give myself this treat that I want, or buy the thing that I want, or
Yeah.
spend money on buy a dessert at dinner because I
Mhm.
don't deserve it because I'm feeling bad about myself. So knowing the ways that you interact with money, again, as coping. Another part of personality, like if you, I've talked a lot about anxious or avoidant,
Mhm.
but if you are control oriented, so in my
Mhm.
story, and I still connect with this. I hoard money.
Hmm.
So I think a lot of that had to do with a little bit in my family, but also just like in order to feel safe, I like to have a lot of buffer. And then
Hmm.
as I moved out from like not having very much money at all in college and grad school and not working for a couple years, as you're in training, then you start to get money and you have more money in the bank, but
Hmm.
I wasn't necessarily spending more money because I wasn't used to it. And there was a lot of fear about, well, if I spend it, where am I going to get it again? Am I
Yeah.
actually gonna make enough to like increase my livelihood, my lifestyle? Um, so yeah, if you what I was kind of going back to is like personality wise, if you're conscious, if you have insight into how you interact with money and how you're trying to get your needs met through money,
Hmm.
then knowing that you're more empowered to have agency over making decisions that are integrating the emotion, but not being totally overrun by the
Hmm.
emotion.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful what you said about, the way that we can punish or reward ourselves. I think we do that in a lot of ways. I think another way that we do that is with food.
Yeah.
That food can be another sort of coping or soothing mechanism. But yeah, when you said that, I think there was some conviction that happened of like, oh yeah, no, I've definitely bought things on a whim or emotionally or because I was feeling a certain way to help regulate that emotion. And yeah, I think sort of that can feed into all sorts of different cycles, whether it's a shame response of like, oh crap, like I'm bad at money, or like I can't believe I made that decision. Um, and I think you know, beyond money, I think something that I talk with a lot of my clients about is just how beholden to our emotions we can be as human beings. And that's, not necessarily a bad thing, but that's just sort of a normal thing, that we as human beings are emotional creatures. Um, and I think something that we've kind of been touching on here and there are some of the cultural factors of the ways in which we imbibe the messages and the norms and the systems that are around us. And I, thinking about sort of the context that you and I live in and being in the United States, and I think there are a lot of systems that individuals are beholden to, whether it is, things like minimum wage or like health insurance or um sort of you mentioned banking, like just what kind of banking services are available to you with your tax bracket or what you have available.
Yeah.
um and I think you've kind of touched on this, but I'm curious, like, how do you think about it? I think especially for clients who maybe have fewer means, um how do you handle the balance between what you are able to control versus what you aren't able to control? And
Mhm.
I think about like throughout my training in grad school, I've seen such a wide range of SES, of social economic status, of,
Yeah.
seeing people who are living on the streets, who have very low means, who are getting services pretty much for free, and people who have absolutely no problem paying my cash rate at a private practice,
Yeah.
don't even blink an eye, don't even, feel any twinge when, I say a number out loud. That
Mhm.
there's just so such a wide range.
Yeah. Yeah, and to answer that, I would even add other examples of people who make a lot of money and then do balk at the fee, that they could
Mm,
afford
mhm.
it, but they
Yeah.
might not value it, or
Mhm.
something else maybe is coming up for them as to why they still want a discount, or they have some feelings about the fee. I to be honest, I think I feel my own privilege and then my own experience working. I haven't really worked in other systems. So I think that I am biased and I think I am lacking in a fuller kind of in like, I'd say metabolized understanding of how it works
Sure.
across the spectrum.
Mhm.
But I would say, I think from that lens, I think that there's still the possibility you talked about control, to know what are the things you're able to control and what are the
Mhm.
things that you're not,
Yeah.
putting framework around that for yourself. So the example of someone who is on living on the streets, their list of what things are out of their control is going to be quite high. someone who is maybe solidly middle class, there might be a more complexity and maybe more of a challenge for them to be honest with themselves of what
Mm.
is actually in their control or not. There might be more things that they feel are out of their control than are in reality. And that to me, I think then comes to the idea of value based spending and values where it comes to money.
Mhm.
Um, Again, in some ways, these things can be value neutral, but in the sense that that can be variable for each individual. So what I mean by that is, let's say you value travel and you're in your life, you value the experiences of seeing other cultures and seeing other countries and doing that, putting that as a value in your budget, putting a lot of money towards that is going to be aligned with your values. Um, it as Whereas for someone else who might have the same level of financial flexibility, maybe they're valuing children and having children and the financial responsibility of bearing and raising children. Like that's
Yeah.
not a cheap experience of life.
Mhm.
So those things can be in conflict. You might have a lot of values and not enough resources to in a like integrated and holistic way, like feel like you're spreading yourself out in a way that feels aligned with all your values.
Mhm.
On the flip side, you might have the resources and for some reason you're not giving them into the values. So you feel like you don't have control, but you actually do. So like
Mhm.
let's understand that and maybe unpack why you're restricting yourself in that way.
No, I think using sort of a value-based framework I think is really helpful. And I think that brings up, a thought about sort of money's not just emotional, but it's also relational. That, when you start to bring other people into the mix, into the conversation, whether it is a partner, a spouse, whether it is a parent-child relationship or a sibling relationship where there's money being shared or money being covered or decisions being made jointly. I think that thinking about it within that value-based framework can be really helpful in at least sort of um, expanding and nuancing the conversation. That I think a lot of times when I hear couples argue about money, in the couples work I do, it 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 starts at like the bottom line of this is how much money we have, this is how much this person's spending, and the
Mhm.
fingers start getting pointed, and uh, you know when you sort of take a step back and start to peel back the layers, oftentimes I see people with very different views of money, very different values when it comes to money, very different things that money represents, whether it is a sense of security, whether it's a sense of you sort of talked about fun or sort of being able to like treat yourself or being able to reward yourself. There's so many different things that money can represent, and I think those values can sort of help put some language, give some language to, what it is that you're actually talking about when you're having a hopefully a collaborative conversation with somebody
Yeah.
else about money.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that even intersects with what you're talking about with culture too, because
Mhm.
there's values in culture, and so
Totally.
different cultures or cultural groups that you're a part of, there might be a script for what we value as this collective group.
Mhm.
Um, so, like again, kids is a good example. Most cultural groups value having children, and
Mhm.
so that will be an expectation that's built into the money system. Um, Depending on which, again, cultural groups you grew up with, you might align or not align with liking nice things. And I
Mhm.
think
Mhm.
it can,
Yeah.
or you can feel really like
Luxury
resistant, like, oh,
items.
yeah, yeah. Or like, oh, I shouldn't like nice things. I should buy always the less affordable thing, even though honestly, I really like the premium this. And
Yeah.
um, so there can be some conflict maybe with your cultural group on that way. It feels quite relational in
Mhm.
terms of again the cultural group that you're a part of and how that compares as you either differentiate from that cultural group or or align yourself with that
Mhm.
group.
Totally. Yeah. I think another very interesting cultural consideration that comes to mind, and I think, perhaps we have, we can both speak to this to some degree is sort of the spiritual values. You mentioned sort of your parents talking about giving to the church, that this is sort of the expectation or this is the percentage that is supposed to go that way. And I think that, that's another uh, big source of emotion or a big source of messages that we get around
Yeah.
money about sort of what it means to be generous or what it means to be charitable or what it means to be a good, you know, Christian, Muslim, and any sort of spiritual religious group that we ascribe ourselves to. Um, you know, what are some of the experiences that you've had sort of with some of the spiritual messaging around money, and how have you sort of tried to incorporate or, maybe even just understand, what that means for you personally?
Yeah. Yeah, I think my spiritual journey with it has been quite interesting because like I said, I was raised in a family that went to church and integrated a faith in God, a Christian faith in God. And so tithing and giving to the church and this isn't money, but also giving time to the church. And a
Hmm.
lot of people
Hmm.
say time is money. So investing of yourself into a church community was highly valued and a part of my upbringing. And I think struggled with it because I've always felt so independent. And so I think I
Mm.
felt some resistance. I tithed, but I didn't do so with a joyful heart. I
Hmm.
was
Hmm.
maybe not skeptical of where the money was going, but I think I was like, what does my $5 actually matter?
Hmm.
I think some of the messages I would hear would be, it's not your money, it is God's money,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
honestly, I think I felt a little bit conflicted about
Yeah.
always. Part of my story has too is I have separated myself from the church in the
Hmm.
last maybe 5 years, and so I think being able to have this money journey, um, again with kind of an influence of generosity and
Hmm.
stewarding money resources well, particularly if they're coming from God. God gives you gifts,
Hmm.
and then you should respond in that same giving like response. Um, I think for me that got kind of muddled with some other generally like religious trauma, but also this like I felt tight about it. Like I don't know if I buy that. I don't know if I feel good about
Yeah.
giving. I don't feel always settled in my own finances. And so I
Hmm.
think there was that like scarcity mindset about it.
Hmm.
And so I think when I was going through some of my faith journey with other aspects of my life, I really held myself like tight about that. And I wanted to know how I felt about it before giving. Um, which I think my personality maybe impacted that more than just the system at
Hmm.
large.
Hmm.
Now, I think with some more healing, again, even if I'm not participating in a faith tradition like explicitly,
Hmm.
I'm beginning again with healing to feel more generous again.
Yeah.
I feel like, okay, I might not be tithing, but I can be more free with my money because it's
Hmm.
not, I don't feel like it's either be trying to be controlled. I don't
Yeah.
feel like I'm forced to give. It really is
Hmm.
more a spirit of generosity. So I think for people who are either in the church or not, I think those are factors that I'm curious about.
Totally.
And again, the messaging is like give generously, but I don't think we can be just told to do that. I think it really does
Yeah.
have to come from within. And I don't
Hmm.
know if we're always taught like actually how to do that and have it
Yeah.
feel integrated.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. I think it's kind of like any other virtue of like, can you force yourself to be humble or can you force yourself to truly forgive or, any other sort of virtue
Right.
that like if
Yeah.
it's not resonant and not, sort of integrous to some degree, then maybe it doesn't completely devalue the virtue, but there's something sort of authentic about being able to give from a joyful place, from a generous place, as opposed to feeling the word that came to my mind was coerced. Um,
Yes.
where
Yeah.
it sort of feels almost manipulative of like, oh, like if you don't give, and almost like somebody's watching you, whether it's
Yeah.
God who's watching you, then it sort of feels like, oh, like, well, I have to give. I don't have a choice in the matter.
Well, it makes me think of I think what I meant before about the scarcity. But you said coerce, and I think that's so often common too, as people's stories with trauma around money, whether it's you've been in a relationship where money has been used as a manipulation, whether it's a system or let's say a church or even a family system where again, money was used to control or manipulate. And then again, kind of thinking about what we were talking about with other needs or cultural systems like health insurance. I think about how being able to afford basic needs or basic like life-saving um, care, I'll say. Um, Sometimes that can be that you want to pay into that because it feels good. You're feeling that again, that joyful giving almost like I value this. I'm excited to pay my money for this because I'm receiving benefit from it. Other times I think it's so common to feel coerced by it or why am I spending all this money or why am I paying for this service and it's not actually helping me. It's not actually giving me back what I would hope it to be: security, safety, joy, whatever it might be. So I think that can happen again in systems and relationships or even with different parts of our culture, again, like health insurance or like taxes, like this thing that's always going to be a budget line and we have a relationship with how we feel related to it.
Yeah, that was a similar direction that my mind was going in terms of, how in a lot of unfortunate cases that money can be used to abuse and to traumatize, and
Yeah.
that it can be used to control. And that when you have some of those trauma reactions to money, then that might be, you know, uh, uh, and I think the thought that comes to mind is that if money is only money to you, then that's sort of an indication of your own privilege. That
Yes.
you know, if money is bringing up emotions for you or even trauma, then, chances are that, there's some unresolved relationship with money that, is probably worth exploring or, sort of
Yeah.
something that's been done to you. Um, and
Or I'd add like a unresolved to the trauma. So I'm thinking, I keep talking about health insurance, but it's on my mind because this bit part of my story about I think 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer, and so I went through treatment, and I'm fine now. Like it's resolved enough, and yet it's chronic. So there's like ways in which at the time with money my husband had benefits through his employer. He had a really good plan. So health insurance and the care that I was receiving was not a financial stress. It felt like I did not have to incorporate that as part of the trauma that I was going through. And yet I think I felt quite entangled with the need for that health insurance. Like it wasn't stressful, but if I lost it, it would be stressful. So like it was kind of not coercion, but it felt like entangled. And fast forward now to currently, my husband will be leaving that position and joining my practice, and our health insurance will be shifting. And so I am thinking about how can I recognize and appreciate the privilege we had, the resource we had that we don't need in the same way now. And if I stay so tied to that and so anxious about losing something that was good for a time, I think it keeps me tied to the trauma and doesn't allow me to separate from it and now have a new way of interacting with it and understanding again it was needed then and now it's not needed and I can have a bit more spaciousness around that financial constraint. So that might be hard maybe to apply to other instances, but I've been really thoughtful about how to, again, when we think about security and what money can give us with security, when things in our life change for better or for worse, can we change with it and not just allow the financial part of it get so constraining and we get stuck and we get like, we're not able to then grow and move on.
Yeah. I think that's really helpful. I think as human beings, we're constantly in stages of growth. And if our sort of financial health can't grow with the rest of us, if it gets sort of
Yeah.
left behind, then, it can sort of be this developmental arrestment of we're sort of still viewing money through that sort of past lens. And like you said, it might have been useful at the time, but just like with any sort of thing, like even at a physical level, that your muscles grow, you go through puberty, you go through different physical stages that your body has to grow in order to keep up with the changes in the demands. And if your financial muscles aren't growing in
Yeah.
the same way, um, then they're going to get left behind, and there's going to be sort of a maladaptivity to that.
And it always just makes you think about grief. I mean, so much of the work we
Mm,
do, usually with psychotherapy, is grief work,
absolutely.
whether it's a, concrete death or lost relationship, or it's just the grief of a life that um, we're living a life that we didn't want to have, or
Yeah.
a situation happened, that we didn't. So this, I think, is so relevant to money too. Like you might have to grieve the family that you had, or the upbringing or the education you had around money, the lack of privilege, the privilege that you had,
Hmm.
the choices you made. Maybe you were truly really irresponsible with money,
Sure.
and having to contend with that and grow from it through grief, I think,
Hmm.
gives you the opportunity of that development that you're talking about. But yeah, grief just feels so relevant.
I think it's a really compassionate way to put it. I think that it's one of those things that whenever it does come up in with my therapy clients, uh, it feels very tangible and visceral, and I think sometimes it's a little easier to sort of connect with some of those emotions, as opposed to it being so abstract. And
Yeah,
like sort of what you're describing, some of those griefs can be intangible griefs about
yeah.
the wishes that we had, or the life that we imagined for ourselves, or the way that money made us feel in the past, or the decisions that we made that I think sometimes we don't always recognize just how much of an impact that's had on us.
Yeah, and limit to like, again, thinking about what we're talking about with the values, sometimes there might be grief in that you can't have everything.
Hmm.
So there, like,
Yeah.
we make decisions and we are choosing one door and shutting another door.
Hmm.
Again, there's
Hmm.
grief because it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, I want to do this thing and I can't also do this other thing.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of some of the clients that I've had that, once kids enter the picture, that I think what you just described just there becomes so real of, you
Yeah.
have to put some of perhaps your own financial wants on hold to sort of provide for the needs of your children. And,
Yeah.
that, it doesn't mean that you stop being an individual that has your own desires and wants and all those feelings. But there's a whole, like you said, a whole shift in your priorities, a whole shift in the balance sheet, and what you're trying to sort of, the system that you're trying to keep afloat.
Yes, and I think the danger there is if you're not aware of it, it could be that you could have feelings about that shift. Of
Mhm.
course, there might be, even anger like, oh, I don't have the amount anymore to spend on myself. Now I'm spending on my children. Um, it might feel like there's joy there, but also the like, "Ugh," and I also feel angry about that. And
Yeah.
yet, if it's unacknowledged, maybe that gets transferred to the child. You're blaming the child for that when that was not up to them at all
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
be a part of that dynamic in your life and your choices. So I think, yeah, the more you can recognize and acknowledge and encounter those emotions that are there,
Mhm.
the less unhelpful dynamics will be that could emerge after the fact.
This might be, sort of going into more like practical decision, but, I'm curious, like, as you've become more financially literate yourself, and as you've sort of gained more experience in terms of like running a business and sort of, navigating finances, what kinds of ways have you learned to budget well? And, I think we as therapists aren't necessarily financial advisors, we're not giving financial advice, but there have been clients that have come to me, and, we've had to talk very candidly and practically about, okay, you're coming to me for therapy, and there's this huge part of your life that's having a real emotional impact. And if we can get you on a good budget, that will naturally have a positive impact in your life, and maybe probably going to have a positive impact on your mood, and other aspects of
Mhm.
your mental health functioning. So, yeah, I'm curious, like, what have you come to in terms of, and I think, maybe another aspect of this question is, where do you have the rigidity and where do you have the flexibility in your budget in terms of, I think sometimes it
Mhm.
feels overwhelming and intimidating to feel like you have to keep track of every cent that comes in, um,
Yeah.
versus like the overall principles and the overall sort of, um, again, going back to values that you're sort of setting up for yourself.
Yeah, that's a really good question because even as you said that, I was thinking about the times in my life where I truly was controlling my money to such a degree that I knew where every cent was going and I was
Hmm. Hmm.
organizing it and controlling it. But that was not helpful for me. I think that
Hmm.
kept me more in a place of not panic, but anxiety about money, control. Like I didn't feel free and I didn't
Hmm.
feel, yeah, it didn't feel good time in my life. So I think a couple of things on a very high level, I think encouraging people to understand that personal finance, there's a lot of different parts to it. So there's the budgeting piece, which I can get more detailed in, but there's also investments. I mean, these are all things that could go into your budget, but just categories.
Hmm.
Investing and thinking about retirement or just later in life, thinking about saving, thinking about taxes, thinking about health insurance, thinking about debt. So there's a lot of different categories of personal finance that I feel like are things to become educated on
Hmm.
and also will influence each other. And then obviously there are people to help you learn this, people who like apps and podcasts and courses and specialists who can advise you. So yeah, just to maybe understand that that is available to you would be kind of a very high level approach. When it comes to budgeting, there are different kinds of budgets. And so I think, again, just being aware that there's different kinds of budgets and
Totally.
maybe looking at them and seeing which one does work for you at this phase of your life. And also it could change in a different phase of your life. I think just to name just a couple of them, and this is going to limit, I mean, I'm not going to talk about everything, but there are a traditional, like, let's say a budget where you are organizing it by percentage.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I kind of alluded to that when I talked about my story, but for some people, there can be like 50% of your budget goes to necessary expenses, 30% to discretionary, 20% to savings and debt. And I think there are some categories that are going to like clearly fit in one of those three buckets,
Hmm.
but it is also up to you to label them, to categorize them. And
Mm.
this is necessary, this is not necessary. So,
Yeah.
is eating out necessary? Probably not. But if you are trying to live like a whole life, maybe it's still, you still have that as a budget line. You know, you're not
Mhm.
going to take that out. Another example of budgeting would be goal-based budgeting. So maybe
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
you have a hard time with even that level of delineation, and
Mm.
it's more important for you to have two or three main goals. So you put a percentage of your income to those goals, and then everything else is flexible. So like
Mhm.
you just don't spend more than you have in your bank account, but
Okay.
you're at the top already
Mhm.
kind of accounting for certain things. For me, that is too open. I
Mhm.
feel like um and for me with budgeting, I feel a lot of freedom actually when I can say, I want to spend this much money toward my own personal therapy. I want to
Mhm.
spend this much money towards, again, eating out or even something like personal care or like massages. That's not in my budget right now. But if I was like, yeah, I'm so excited I have this much money, let's say $100 a month to spend on massages, then you are excited to spend that. When your massage comes that month, it's like, yeah, I have the money and I set it aside and now I get to do this thing. So I think it's really common, I think, for budgeting to feel limiting to people.
Mhm.
But if you can reframe it, then and have it actually work with the actual numbers that you have, I think it can be empowering and exciting
Yeah.
and freeing.
Yeah, I like that word, I think, it can feel so, constricting and trapping when it feels like you have to spend your money a certain way, or you don't have margin, you don't have any sort of room to breathe. Um,
Yeah.
and I mean, that's been my experience too, that, when you have, um, and I think privilege again sort of comes into that, but when you have sort of the ability to have a little bit more, understanding of where your money is going, and how much you have available to you. Even if it's not, buying super luxury items, just again, going back to the emotional impact of just feeling like, oh, like, it's okay. Another aspect of my own life is just like, I feel like I've so for so long just wanted to get to the point where I can go out to eat and not feel guilty. Like that's been like my own
Yeah.
personal
Yeah.
goal. Like I think uh, maybe that's sort of like a millennial experience as well, just sort of with our own sort of, I guess, generational cultural experience with money, and the things that we've experienced in our lifetime. But yeah, I mean that was I wouldn't say that was a financial goal, but it was sort of like a financial like litmus test for me of like where I felt like I was at.
Yeah. That's such a great example because I could imagine if you didn't like mentalize that, like put words to that and then like maybe set your life in a way that like use that as a goal or like as that
Mhm,
litmus
mhm.
test, you could have maybe eaten out for the rest of your life and always felt guilty
Yeah,
about it.
totally.
Whatever your money
Mhm,
situation was
mhm.
like,
Yeah.
maybe it always you felt tied to that. And yet and say even if your budget line was like $20 a month was how much you did, that $20 maybe you wouldn't feel guilty about. You would feel excited. You would feel maybe again grief, like you'd want it to be more, but you wouldn't have to be tied up in that emotion. But and again, I think that's just where the mindfulness comes about it and then working through the emotions that come up so that you are freed from that emotion as much as possible.
Well, we're going up to the end of our time together, and so I want to finish with, I think something that you mentioned is, wanting to expand this conversation and wanting to sort of encourage people to have conversation and be thoughtful and mindful of these types of topics. How would you, again, sort of think about just how taboo money can be in so many different conversations, so many different circles, whether it's your own personal finances, whether it is paid transparency, whether it is cultural experiences, gendered experiences, all sorts of different ways in which money has, its hand in all different aspects of our life. Whether this is with like, encouraging people to talk with a therapist or a financial advisor, or maybe even just a partner or a friend. What are some ways that you sort of can encourage people to sort of get over some of that taboo fear and to
Mhm.
start talking about it in healthy ways?
Yeah. I think if you're so new to this and you really never externalized any of these thoughts before, the first place I would start is to find some podcasts or maybe some people on social media who are I would say specialists, so not just
Yeah,
like anybody, but who are
totally.
educated and talk about it. I think being able to start hearing people talk about it begins to set those like very foundational pathways in your brain to make it something that becomes a way that you think and then a way that you get to talk about it. So that would be like the first place I would start. And you can read about it, but I think there is something valuable of hearing it talked out loud.
Yeah.
Um, so that I think that would give you education, but also just like normalize it a bit for you. I think being able to talk about it with people in your life who are already there would
Mm, mhm.
be an encouragement I'd have. So, um, to think about, with your therapist, maybe a money issue comes up and you push yourself to just be explicit about what you're thinking about. To be honest, your therapist might have a hard time talking about money too. So that
That's
could be,
that's
maybe
fair.
not the best.
Mhm.
That might be something to work through. Same
Okay.
with your partner or a friend. I think ways of starting the conversation could be questions of like, "Hey, do you budget?" And just like see what they say. Maybe they say
Mhm.
no, then yes, and you just start the conversation. Or, hey, have you started? Do you invest or like do you have a 401k at work? Or
Mhm.
like these like really explorational questions might for one, you might have a friend in your life who's really educated and does like to talk about these things and they might help you start the like engage with the conversation. Um But a lot of these questions can be quite non-threatening and can go really far or just be really shallow.
Totally.
If you're ready for a few more steps, I think being able to, talk about pay transparency, say, hey, this is how much I make in a year. This is what my budget is every month. Or um, another example, if you're, let's say, going on vacation with a friend or going out to dinner with a friend, um, maybe practice making it more explicit about what the numbers are of what you're doing. And obviously with a partner, I think there's a lot of different ways of thinking through different options. So those are my first thoughts. And you could find someone like me who nerds out on it, gets really excited about it, really fun. And that I think can spur just more energy into it rather than the emotions, again, that are very commonly there. The anxiety, the shame, the hesitation, the sheepishness about it all.
Totally. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks for sharing. So you have, like I mentioned, you have your own group practice and you guys just started a podcast, which is so cool and so amazing. Can you talk a little bit about your practice, who you guys serve, what sort of regions you serve, and then also your podcast? What is that about and what can people expect if they go check it out?
Absolutely. Yeah. The group practice is in Seattle, Washington. So currently we're only servicing people in Seattle in person or virtually throughout Washington. Hopefully that will expand in the future, but we're not quite there yet. We work with a pretty big range of people in terms of ages. We do see children, teens, and adults. We all practice in a way that is psychodynamic, psychoanalytic, so depth oriented. I think you talk about that enough on your podcast. Maybe people will know what that means. But honestly, actually, to jump then into the podcast, our goal for the podcast is to make therapeutic concepts and specifically psychoanalytics, or the way that we practice concepts, talk about them in a way that are easy to understand. So we're not just talking about jargon. We're not just marketing it to other therapists or clinicians, but we're trying to make these ideas about the way that we think and work and are as people, use simple language and just make it something that's digestible. Um, I'm jumping around, but the other thing I'll say about the practice is we also do psychological testing. So we specialize in a lot of areas across the board in the practice, but we do a lot of trauma. And for testing, we work with neurodiversity and ADHD, autism, those kinds of things. And relationships and money and being with yourself. So like all of these things I think are topics that in the mentorship, the supervision I provide my clinicians, I'm doing a lot of education, but also like helping them get comfortable talking about, money and other things so that we're really able to engage with these deeper parts of the person.
Awesome.
And we're hiring, so we're always expanding, and that would be my plug. If these are kinds of things that you want to grow as a clinician, the practice might be a good place to be very embodied in how you show up in the room.
And I'll have links on my website. But for people who want to check them out, it's relationalpsych.group. And on social media, it's at relational psych. So,
yeah,
awesome.
Exactly.
Well, thank you, Carly, Dr. Claney, for joining me. And I look forward to how people receive this episode.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thank you for joining your thoughts with ours. For more curious minds, new episodes drop every first and third Wednesday. Where Did Your Mind Just Go is a production of Coastal Therapy Group, and this episode was edited by Serena Rio. Until next time, I'm Dr. Gabriel. Keep wandering.